This is the Discovery Files podcast from the U.S. National Science Foundation. My name is Nate Potker.
And I'm Adam Eggers.
Our health, prosperity, and security depend on human behavior, how we think, interact, how our society changes and grows. What decisions and how a person conducts themselves can have great impacts on others. These are key components of research within NSF's Social, Behavioral, and Economic Sciences Directorate. Joining us today are two NSF-supported researchers, Abigail Marsh, a professor in the Department of Psychology and the Interdisciplinary Program in Neuroscience at Georgetown University, and Joshua Greene, professor of psychology and a member of the Center for Brain Science faculty at Harvard University, both of whom have been thinking about, studying, and publishing on these concepts. Thank you both for joining us today. What is altruism?
Altruism is, I think, most commonly defined as any behavior that was intended to help some beneficiary other than the actor. If you ask a biologist, you get a little bit different definition. They just care about outcomes. But when you're talking to psychologists like we are, we care a lot about intention. Were you hoping to help the person?
And one of the things that's complicated about defining altruism, especially in the real world, is that altruism tends to bring rewards to those who are altruistic. So, if it's sort of built into the definition that, oh, you're doing this and not expecting anything in return, but, once you've been around the block a few times, you start to notice that when you're nice, people are nice to you, right? So the line between altruism and wise strategic behavior is kind of blurry, but I think as Abby said, it begins at least on a psychological level with that positive intention.
Yeah, you could sort of think of the sort of dictionary definition of altruism as the behavior intended to help somebody else is almost a platonic ideal, impossible of definitively proving, because so many human behaviors have multiple motivations. And of course, as Josh said, when we're out there behaving in the real world, it can be really difficult to parse apart what somebody's true motivation is. And it's often obscured even from ourselves, why we act as we do.
How does the brain play into it?
Well, all behavior starts with the brain. There is no behavior without a brain. So I think understanding the neural processes that support altruism is essential to having a complete understanding of where altruism comes from. One thing that's essential is what Josh said a second ago, which is that there are multiple motivations for behaving altruistically. And there are different kinds of altruism that have different brain processes that support them. So, for example, helping somebody because you anticipate that they will reciprocate at some point in the future is subserved in part by regions that promote reward processing, right? Anticipating something good will happen in the future to yourself if you do a behavior. I'm interested in altruism that, as far as we can tell, is not aimed at achieving any kind of an external reward, like donating a kidney to a stranger or rescuing somebody from a fire. That kind of altruism we don't understand as well. But we do understand some of the pieces of it. Certainly a big part of that kind of altruism is empathy. So you have to be able to understand that somebody is in danger to begin with before you are motivated to help them. And so some of the brain processes that support that kind of altruism include empathic responding in regions like the insula, the anterior cingulate cortex, and the amygdala, that enable us to interpret, okay, this person needs help, and then do to something that's sort of verging on alchemy, but we hope at some point it will be known better than that. The detection that somebody else is in danger is converted to a desire to try to help them.
You mentioned the altruism states of someone going into a fire. How does that play into like first responders, for example, like, people even deciding to take up that line of employment, whether it's military, whether it's police, fire, doctors, nurses, any of those?
That's a great question. And I will say I've studied the brains of a few people who have saved people from drowning and attacks and that sort of thing. But I have not studied first responders myself. And I think there probably is a distinction, though, based on the personality studies that have been done. There's a real difference between somebody who chooses to go into a line of work where they will be facing danger and doing very, physically challenging, risky things as part of their job, and somebody who is just, driving to the store to get some groceries and happens upon a fire where they sort of spontaneously have to decide whether to help. My guess is that people who go into first responder type roles like challenges and risk. They're people who enjoy that sort of thing. Thank goodness, because otherwise we wouldn't have too many firefighters around us. They're often people who are very physically strong and are so very good at those kinds of jobs. And so that does tend to self-select for men over women. Not always, of course, but just statistically. And I think you don't see as many of those differences when you're looking at people who spontaneously decide to help other people, because you don't really have time for a lot of decision making, especially when you're saving somebody from a fire spontaneously.
How does it work when we're talking about altruism traits or functions being either taught, or are they hardwired into the brain, or how is it that some people are more so than others? Kind of a nature versus nurture type of question for both of you.
I do want to go back and say one more thing about the last question, though, because I was just thinking about it. I will say it's almost certainly also the case that most people who go into first responder type roles also are motivated by a desire to help their community, a desire to sort of do good in the world, and a desire to help other people. But my guess is that there's a much more complicated mix of factors that drive people into a profession rather than cause them to make a single spontaneous decision.
One of the biggest factors here is culture, especially when it comes to the range of people that one considers within one's altruistic or moral circle. So, if you look all around the world, you'll find humans and other animals that are beneficent towards kin, towards individuals who are closely related to them. And in humans, you see widespread reciprocal altruism. That is, I scratch your back, you scratch mine, where you're directly benefiting from the people who you are nice to. Where there's huge cultural variation is in how big that circle is. And culture seems to have a lot to do with this. There is an interesting story about economics, and here a lot of this work has been done by Joe Henrich and colleagues, that we think of, let's say, free markets as this sort of cold, impersonal world. And in some ways it might make people sort of less closely tied to their families, but it also makes people more altruistic towards and cooperative with strangers. And there's also a story about religion here. And Ara Naranzayan, for example, has done wonderful work kind of cataloging the growth of religions that include larger and larger groups of people under the umbrella. So, if you're a Christian and I'm a Christian, then even if we've never met before, if we know the sort of religious secret handshakes, right, we can say, okay, you're good, you're someone I can trust. And then there's a further story about secular institutions, democracies with trustworthy judicial systems and so on, not perfectly trustworthy, but, by historical standards, not too bad, kind of taking over that role of serving as a kind of guarantor of broader trust. So the expanding circle of care and concern is a fascinating historical story, and I know Abby has done some wonderful work on this recently. So I don't know, maybe that if you want to elaborate on that.
Absolutely, and those are such great points, and it's such I think one of the central questions when it comes to altruism, because most people are capable of altruism for their closest circle of kin, for their own families, for their own child, for, moving to help them because they actually care about their well-being. And the thing that's more variable, as Josh said, and in some ways a little more interesting because of that, is why people help people they don't have any prior existing relationship to. There are a lot of cultural factors that play into that, as well as factors that seem to be more innate. In general, it seems that most people have some capacity to care about other people's welfare, but that tendency does vary in the population. So we do see, for example, a small subset of people who have high levels of psychopathic traits, which I also study, who seem to have very little capacity to care about other people for their own sake. That's pretty close to the scientific definition of love, for what it's worth, right? Caring about somebody else's welfare as an intrinsically good thing. And people who are highly psychopathic just don't seem to have that capacity. It doesn't mean they're never nice to people, right? And that's what's so interesting about altruism is you can often behave in ways that are nice to people for your own selfish reasons. And that's not a bad thing. The good thing is that most societies are set up to promote behaviors that help other people, sort of regardless of the reason that you're doing it. In any case, so we have some people who don't seem to care about other people's welfare intrinsically. We have most of us in sort of the middle who are capable of caring about others, but that motivation sort of is always in some degree of tension with caring about ourselves. And then we have, at the other end of the continuum, people who seem to be unusually caring about other people, including people that they've never met before. And these seem to be the people who are most likely to do things like give kidneys to strangers and rescue people from drowning. Now, whether that is a reflection of inherited versus sort of environmental factors, we don't know. There's very little research on that factor or on that question. There are lots and lots of studies on different personality traits and different behavioral outcomes, most of which arrive at about the same answer, which is that most personality traits are roughly 50% heritable, meaning about half the variation in that trait is due to genetic factors and the other half is due to environmental factors. So that'd be my best guess when it comes to altruistic traits as well. And as Josh said, a big chunk of the environmental factors that are responsible for promoting altruism have these really interesting relationships to economic systems and religious and cultural frameworks. One of the big cultural factors that I've studied in my own research is well-being at the level of a society. And one of the really cool things that we've found in a couple different studies now is that at a societal level, when people report higher levels of well-being, which are due to economic and cultural and religious factors and governmental factors of various kinds, they tend to be more altruistic. So in societies where people report a high level of life satisfaction, they are more likely to volunteer for charities, donate money to charity, give blood, give organs, give bone marrow, and even treat non-human animals more kindly, which suggests that something about well-being expands people's capacity to have this very high circle of moral concern.
We've talked a little bit about some of the ways altruism manifests. Can we talk a little bit about, or can you describe the different types of altruism?
I mean, I'm happy. I'm happy to promote one of my students' recent meta-analyses because I think it does a really nice job parsing apart the domain of altruistic behavior. And the best thing is it maps on perfectly to the findings of another behavioral study. So basically 2 studies, one by my student Sean Rhodes, have come up with about the same answer about there being kind of 3 different kinds of altruism. The first is altruism motivated by true care for the other person's welfare. And that's usually in response to evidence that somebody else is suffering or in need. And in most people, that seems to elicit a strong sort of desire to help them, depending on their circumstances. The second major kind of prosocial behavior is reciprocal altruism, or cooperation sometimes, which means helping somebody because you anticipate they're going to help you in the future or because they've helped you in the past. Interestingly, this is not a kind of altruism that we only see in humans. There are really interesting examples of non-human animals engaging in that same kind of reciprocal altruism. And then the final kind of altruism is probably more limited to humans, at least according to the most recent research I've seen, which is sort of equity-based altruism, which means altruism aimed at achieving a fair outcome. So sacrificing resources to ensure that everybody gets sort of a fair situation. So imagine you're going out to dinner with friends and, there's a big pile of food put in the middle of the table. You don't take it all for yourself because most people think that that's just sort of normatively bad. And so satisfying norms related to equity is another reason that people help others. And we don't tend to see that kind of behavior in animals as often.
That begs the follow-up. How are you seeing, or what are you learning about how children and animals are manifesting altruism or altruistic behaviors?
What's interesting is I've only studied children when it comes to very antisocial behaviors because, to be honest, that's a really significant public health question. But I'm very interested in the development of altruism and certainly the evolution of altruism. So what we know about mammals as a species is that we have to be born with some tendency to care about the welfare of others. And it's not exclusively true of mammals, but it is certainly true of all mammals. Why? It's because, of course, mammals are defined by having these very helpless, relatively high need offspring. At the very least, they need milk. Again, we know this because we're all mammals. And that requires that certainly mammalian mothers, at the very least, be wired with the ability to sacrifice their own, energy, time, often welfare, in order to protect their offspring, or you wouldn't have a species pretty soon. So we know that mammals are built for at least altruism when it comes to taking care of their offspring. What's interesting is that a subset of mammals, including humans, but also a number of other what are called cooperative breeding species, usually large carnivores like dogs, wolves, lions, a lot of seals and sea lions, you see a kind of behavior called allomaternal care or alloparenting, which means that animals of that species have developed the ability to care about offspring other than their own. And so certainly in humans, but again, in these other species as well, you'll see that adults of that species will take care of offspring that aren't just theirs. But, maybe your buddy's baby over here needs some help. So, hey, you'll take care of it. And what seems to be interesting about that is that it seems to somehow, whatever happens in an animal's brain, evolutionarily, that allows it to care about offspring other than its own seems to release the altruism floodgates much more broadly, because we know, at least in primate species, that the more allomaternal care a species engages in, the more likely they are to be altruistic, even for other adults as well. So there's just something about the tendency to care for babies of all kinds that really is the sort of prime driver of altruistic capabilities more generally. And of course, this is one thing I really always try to reinforce, is that humans are just the absolute emperors of alloparental care and altruism when it comes to mammalian species. We engage in way more alloparental care than almost any species out there, except maybe domesticated dogs. But we'll take care of anything that looks like a baby. I mean, I've run into traffic myself multiple times to feed baby birds, and I can't tell you how many other people I know who've done something similar, rescued kittens. I mean, who would leave like a kitten, that they saw abandoned at the side of the road to just, sort of molder? Nobody, right? And we don't think anything of that. We're just like, well, maybe there's some sort of monster. And it's like, well, most species are kind of monstrous that way. They'd probably eat it. And humans just don't have that response to babies. We're just like, any baby that comes across our path, we will take care of. That's really deeply embedded in our brains and our evolution, and seems to be the reason that we're capable of altruism for such a wide array of other people. I mean, we're really kind of a magnificent species. And I know that we don't feel that way about ourselves. But I always try to remind people to think about the interactions that they personally have recently had with other human beings, and to just not fail to notice how unbelievably positive most of our interactions with other people are. And the fact that there's some real not nice people out there, which, believe me, I know because I study psychopathy as well, doesn't take away from the fact that most people really are quite capable of a lot of goodness.
Well, I did kind of want to ask a pointed question, but I was curious on how fast thinking and slow speaking kind of meld into this, or try to understand the correlation of how those work together.
Okay, that is Josh's question, and also I want to hear what Josh wanted to say.
So you've teed up a discussion of a paper that we just published. So this is with my postdoc Lucius Caviola, who's fantastic and is really the driving force behind this research. We are interested in altruism, and particularly in the form of charitable donation. This is an enormous opportunity to do good for people, who have any disposable income. And our primary concern was with the effectiveness of people's charitable donations. This will come to fast and slow, I promise, or at least something approximating that. The most effective charities can be like 100 times more effective than typical charities. Right? I mean, to give an example, if to train a guide dog to take care of a blind person in the United States might cost something like $50,000, whereas a surgery that costs less than $100 in the developing world can prevent blindness due to trachoma. All right, so you can have hundreds or even close to 1,000 times more impact by supporting that kind of work. Now, this is not to say that we shouldn't take care of everybody, including people in countries like the United States who are visually impaired. But if you're forced to choose, you might say, well, we should help more people if we can. And that argument leaves a lot of people feeling conflicted. And this is where kind of the fast, slow part comes in. So Lucius and I were interested in trying to understand, what would it take to get people to support more impactful charities? And for a while, I had tried, just making a kind of philosophical argument that says, look, isn't it more important to help more people? And what we found is that works for like a very small subset of people. And then we had this sort of simple idea of saying, well, instead of saying, do this instead of do that, we asked people, how about if you split 50-50? You pick your personal favorite charity, and then also give half of the money, if you want, to a super effective charity, for example, a charity that distributes anti-malarial insecticidal nets, which can save somebody's life for about $5,000 on average. That is, distributing 1,000 nets at that cost would likely save one person. And we did some experiments where we found that people are pretty reluctant to give to the high impact charity over the one that they chose if you just give them a forced choice. But if you give them this 50-50 split option, then they like it much more, and they like it enough more that a lot more money goes to the high impact charity if you offer people the split than if you just force them to choose 50-50. So we did some further research with this and trying to understand the psychology. And what we found is that, this is maybe not surprising, that charitable donation and altruism in general tends to be driven by feelings of personal connection. And I think most people, as Abby said, feel close personal connections with the people who they know best, their family and their friends. And extraordinary altruists seem to be people who have those kinds of feelings for a much wider group of people, including strangers. But most people are not like that so much. But at the same time, they get the argument. They get the idea that, it'd be better to save 100 people for the same amount of money than to save one person. But I really care about the local animal shelter, right? Or I really care about cancer research, especially after what happened to my grandmother, the way she passed away, or whatever it is, right? So what we found is that giving people the 50-50 split allows people to satisfy both desires, that they can act on that feeling of personal connection by supporting the charity that they chose, but then they also get the satisfaction of giving more widely. And we wanted to try to bring this out into the world, and we figured that if we just said, hey, world, make split donations like this, that wouldn't have much of an impact. So we thought, well, we need some way to advertise and incentivize this. So we, first did some studies, saying, well, how about if we add money on top? And we found that people like that even more. People gave even more to the high impact charities. And then we said, well, okay, but where's that money going to come from if we ever try to do this? And we asked people, would you be willing to support a matching fund with part of your donation that so that other people can then donate in this way and have money added on top? So there's a kind of back to this idea of reciprocal altruism, but this time more indirect reciprocity, that is paying it forward for other people. Enough people were happy to do that to cover the costs of these matching funds. So we put these three things together. So you've got the bundling and giving people these incentives, and then getting people to pay for the incentives for future people. And we put this all together in this website called Giving Multiplier, which we launched in late 2020, just before the holiday season. And, we would have been happy if it did a little bit better than Bake Sale, but it ended up being enormously effective. We've raised, I think, $2.3 million on the site, and well over $1 million of that has gone to these high impact charities that almost everybody says they wouldn't have supported if it weren't for Giving Multiplier. So there's a kind of dual process story here, that as a kind of feelings and thinking, where instead of, in a lot of my research, had focused on dilemmas where I force people to make a horrible choice, between doing something that feels terrible or letting people die, right? And we sort of force this nasty conflict between the heart and the head. And now it is much more fun or enjoyable or satisfying to allow people to resolve that conflict and say, okay, great, we can do this. You can do both, and we'll reward you for it, and you can reward other people for it. So that's my happy dual process altruism story.
I love this study so much because I mean, it solves the problem that has been so frustrating for so long, which is that effective altruism just leaves a lot of people cold. I mean, they don't like thinking about altruism as a math problem. What motivates most people to help is an intrinsic feeling of valuing the welfare of whoever they're helping. And that just isn't something that you can force. And yet we know that oftentimes that motivation leads people to give in ways that are not very effective. So and instead of doing what unfortunately a few too many people in the effective altruism movement have tried, which is just telling people you should give effectively, just work with people's natural motivations to help, causes and people and organizations that they feel a connection to already, and wed it to effective giving. I think it's so cool.
Thanks.
Well, taking a couple of things that you guys have and both mentioned and sandwiched it into one, I was a little bit curious on not only kind of how we've evolved as a society and what our trajectory is on that, but over the past couple of weeks, we've seen some articles and news come up regarding performance altruism, and whether you have celebrities or pro athletes taking photographs of large tips that they leave at restaurants, or content creators doing giveaways and things like that. Just kind of curious how that, from both of the aspects of what you guys talked about, how that kind of fits into the overall kind of viewpoint or study in the altruism field.
Well, so I mean, this usually in the research area, goes under the heading of reputation, right? And reputation can be a kind of double-edged sword, right? That it can lead to some of the most sordid and icky feeling kinds of good deeds, but at the same time, it can be really important for stabilizing altruistic behavior. So one example that I love comes from Erez Yoeli and colleagues. They were interested in, well, their applied problem was a system for managing brownouts, so intermittent power failures in California on hot days, and the state of California and the energy utilities really wanted people. They had these devices that would automatically turn off your AC when there was a strain on the power grid, and then turn it back on. And so they wanted people to install these things, and very few people were willing to do this. And I think they might have even tried like paying people to do it. And they were like, oh, if you have to pay me, it must be really bad, right? And that didn't work. And what they tried was something very simple related to reputation, which is, in apartment buildings, they put up a visible sign-up sheet where you could sign up to have one of these things installed. And a few of the, natural altruists, or whatever you want to call it, pure altruists, did it. And then nobody wants to be the jerk who's not doing it. And the more people who sign up, the more everybody feels like they have to sign up. And you get this cascade of virtue, all because of this publicity, right? Now, so on the one hand, you could say, oh, well, that's, terrible. People are just doing this, to impress their neighbors. It's probably psychologically more complicated than that. We've got a lot of things going on, and we want to do these good things, but we're also kind of busy and fearful of novelty, or having some weird machine in your house. And it can be just enough to sort of tip you over the edge. And, so reputation can kind of go both ways, but the internet does weird things with reputation, and you don't need me to tell you that. But I don't know if Abby, if you have further thoughts about reputation and good deeds.
If people believe that they are living in a society in which people tend to be altruistic, and where altruism and helping other people is a normative thing to do, they will help more people. There are lots of great studies demonstrating how powerfully norms motivate people to help. One really good real world example is when it comes to blood donations. Once upon a time in the US, nobody donated blood to strangers for nothing. And there are many places in the world that's still considered just a thing you would never do. And people, in fact, don't do it. And so then when people are in need of blood, if they don't have a relative who's a match for their blood type, they're out of luck. And for a very long time, the U.S. blood supply was mostly provided by people who were being paid for their blood, which came with a lot of ethical and also pragmatic problems. And then sometime in the 1970s, the drives to get people to donate blood just as a good thing to do for other people started to become more successful. And then the idea that blood donation is a good thing that a person does for their community sort of built on itself. And so now we have an all-volunteer blood supply in the United States. And in fact, for many blood types, there's more than enough blood to go around most of the time. Although I will always say, especially if you have a valuable blood type like a O blood type, you should always give. And we see these incredible examples of when there are major national disasters. There have been a couple, for example, mass shootings, unfortunately, where people clearly felt stricken by this terrible thing that had happened to strangers thousands of miles away. And it resulted in an uptick in blood donations in communities all around the country from people who felt this surge of compassion and just felt like, well, what do I do with this surge of compassion? I know I'll donate blood. And that's all because it becomes a norm. And so there's a part of me that thinks I like the idea of a widely liked public figure demonstrating that a cool thing to do with your money is helping people, because it could potentially help increase the perception that that's a normative thing to do, which also increases interpersonal trust if people believe that people around them are likely to help, which can turn into a virtuous circle. The other possible outcome is that everybody sees it as a cynical thing to do. And so they see altruism as not a real thing, but it's something people only do because they're getting fame or status or reputation or something out of it. So I think that would be the interesting question, is how do people perceive it? Because that may determine how ultimately good it is.
Yeah. One thing that's sort of in play here is evaluating people versus evaluating actions, right? And responding to an act of altruism as a character assessment or an assessment of whether or not what the person did was good and is worth emulating. And in a small hunter-gatherer village, the difference between having good character and producing good consequences might not be all that different. That is, there aren't enormous differences in wealth that people have, resources that people have at their disposal to help other people. There aren't new technologies that people could employ or kind of clever ways of helping people that nobody ever thought of. And so there wouldn't be that much of a gap between how much sacrifice you as an individual take on and how much good you're able to do for other people. There's kind of a pretty simple input-output relationship there. But then in the modern world, ordinary middle-class people with some disposable income could save multiple people's lives per year just by making wise donations. And this is just completely alien to ordinary human psychology, right? And there might be, and if that kind of good can be done by advertising it and showing people as positive examples, whether or not their motivations are pure, there's just so much good to be done. So I guess now I'm putting on a bit of my social philosopher hat rather than my scientist hat. But I think that in the modern world, it's a mistake to be too much focused on character as opposed to being focused on actions and outcomes. A world in which everybody's getting a little bit of ego because by doing enormous good for other people, versus a world in which everybody is modest and not trying to show off, but not doing much good for other people. I would much rather live in the first world in that sense, right? So I think that the opportunities that are afforded by modern wealth and modern technology and modern opportunities for reaching people who you otherwise couldn't reach, the benefits of altruistic reputation, I think, are underappreciated, and we should just be happy that it can do so much good and not worry so much about who's really an angel and who's not.
I couldn't agree with you more. And actually, this reminds me of a really sort of major media story that came up a while ago related to reputation and altruism, which was the bad art friend story. And I'm not going to go through the whole convoluted story now, but one of the characters in the story was a woman who gave a kidney to a stranger and then talked about having done so on her Facebook feed and publicized to lots of people that she had given a kidney to a stranger. She was criticized by another character in this whole saga for being, self-serving and status-seeking in publicizing her kidney donation. And I think that was really unfortunate, because the reality is that the reason that people give kidneys to strangers is because they discover that this is a thing you can do, and that there are people out there who've given kidneys to strangers that are really, really glad that they did it and really think that other people might get a lot out of it too. And it's only by people who donate kidneys to strangers talking about their donations that people will learn this is a thing you can do, because there are still people who don't know that yet. And we'll get the perception that this is not a weird thing to do. This is something that, hundreds of people in the country decide to do every year. It's not weird. It probably will never get to the place where it's truly normative, but I would certainly love for it to get to the place, where it's sort of more like marrow donation, where this is a thing that if you're a healthy human being who, has good health insurance, this is something that you should seriously consider. And only by talking about our altruistic actions will we ever get there. And so I think it's kind of, misplaced attention, worrying about whether somebody talking about their altruistic actions is a sign of bad character.
Well, we're running up against the clock here, so I wanted to give you guys the opportunity to have any final thoughts.
Altruism is a lot more normative than most people think. Most people, when they notice that somebody around them needs help, will try to provide it. And in fact, I really wish that sticky, catchy stories like the Kitty Genovese story, the idea that, there's this bystander apathy that I'm sure you heard about, this famous story of a woman in the 1960s, I think, who was attacked by an assailant. There was an apartment building full of people who all just stood there watching. Well, that story is totally false. There were multiple people who actually came to her aid and called the police. And there was a much more recent research study that looked at CCTV footage from all over the world when people were getting attacked by others. And 95% of people who were being attacked and it was caught on CCTV footage were helped by at least one person in their environment. And so I just think it's so important to not be misled and try to pay attention to all the goodness there is out there, because it's really so much more prevalent.
I'll echo that and also, I think it applies to not just our general views of humanity, but our views of other groups and groups to which we don't belong.
Professor Greene, Professor Marsh, our thanks to both of you for taking the time to speak with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for having me. It's really wonderful.
For the Discovery Files, I'm Nate Potker.
And I'm Adam Eggers.
Please subscribe wherever you get podcasts, and if you like our program, share with a friend and consider leaving a review. Discover how the U.S. National Science Foundation is advancing research at nsf.gov.